The heat of the Texas sun beat down on Eli Morgan as he rode his horse along the rough terrain of his land, just a few miles north of Dry Creek. The man was a solitary figure, a former Union scout who had chosen a quiet life after the war. His cabin stood alone, far from the bustle of the small frontier town. He had no use for town gossip or social gatherings. His only company was the land and his cattle, and that suited him fine. But that day, fate had a different plan. The sound of gunfire echoed across the canyon ahead of him. Eli paused, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across his back. The noise wasn't the usual crack of cattle ranchers or the distant thunder of storms. It was different. It was violent. His heart raced. A fight was happening. He spurred his horse forward, guided by the sound of shouting and chaos. As he rounded the bend, he saw them, a group of outlaw bandits, their guns raised, their faces twisted in drunken rage. At the center of the commotion was a young girl, no older than 17, her body trembling as she was held roughly by one of the men. She was Comanche, dressed in torn clothing, with wild, fearful eyes that barely seemed to register what was happening around her. Without hesitation, Eli drew his rifle and aimed. His first shot took down one of the men. The others scattered, surprised by the sudden attack. Eli didn't waste time. He spurred his horse forward and galloped toward the girl, shouting at her to run. She was hesitant, but seeing the danger retreat, she darted into the brush, her feet swift despite the binds on her wrists. Eli couldn't leave her alone, though. He followed her into the wilds, where, hidden from sight, he cut her free. She spoke no English, and he spoke no Comanche, but the language of survival was universal. He handed her water, then helped her mount his horse. He didn't ask questions. He had learned the hard way to avoid getting tangled in the affairs of others. But this was different. This girl was alone, out of place in a world where danger followed her at every turn. He took her to his cabin, deep in the heart of the wilderness. It was far from the reach of the local law, and Eli hoped that it would be enough time to figure out what to do next. As the girl collapsed onto the floor, exhausted, Eli sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He knew one thing for sure. No one was going to let this go without causing trouble. Eli's peaceful life shattered with the arrival of the townsfolk from Dry Creek. He had no idea how they had learned of the girl's presence at his cabin, but when the first pair of men appeared on horseback, the rest followed soon after. The sheriff, a stout man named Calhoun, led the charge, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver, as if ready to draw it at any moment. "She's in there, Eli," Calhoun called out as he approached the cabin, his voice harsh. "You've got some explaining to do." Eli had been preparing for this moment. He had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but he knew the town wouldn't stand for a Comanche girl living under his roof without questions. When the group entered his cabin and saw her, the tension in the room thickened. Naomi, the girl he had rescued, stood in a corner, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress. "She's a savage," one of the townsfolk muttered, clearly disgusted by her presence. Eli's patience snapped. He stood tall, his voice steady as he confronted the group. "She's not a savage," he said. "She's a girl, and I saved her life." But his words fell on deaf ears. The sheriff, taking charge of the situation, barked orders at the group. "We don't know what kind of trouble you've invited into this town, Morgan. If you're gonna keep her here, you're going to have to make it right." Eli was caught in a vice of rules he didn't believe in. The town had no place for a Comanche girl, not even as a rescued soul. Calhoun declared that Eli had no choice but to make things right by marrying her, sealing her fate in the eyes of the law. If he didn't, they'd report her to the government, who would send her back to the reservation. The town made it clear, if Eli didn't marry her, they would brand him an outcast. His life would be ruined. Eli's protest was ignored. In a matter of hours, an impromptu wedding was arranged. In the small church of Dry Creek, under the watchful eyes of a dozen gossips, Eli found himself standing at the altar, staring at the girl who had once been a stranger but was now bound to him by the law. Naomi looked at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her eyes flickered toward the door, as if praying for an escape. The ceremony was short, but it was enough to tie them together in the eyes of the town. Afterward, Eli took her back to the cabin, his anger still bubbling inside him. He had been forced into a marriage with a girl who didn't belong in his world. He didn't want this. He didn't want the responsibility. But in a harsh, unforgiving world of frontier justice, there was no turning back now. Days passed, and the tension between Eli and Naomi remained palpable. They spoke little, each unsure of the other. Eli didn't know what to say to her, and she seemed to retreat further into herself, caught between two worlds, neither of which offered her any comfort. She had been saved, but it felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. At night, Eli would lie awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had become of his quiet life. His cabin had gone from a refuge to a prison. But it wasn't just his life that had changed. Naomi was trapped too. She had no family, no tribe to return to. She was a prisoner of circumstances, just as he was a prisoner to the town's demands. One evening, Eli returned from the cattle range to find Naomi standing outside, staring at the sunset. Her back was straight, and her posture held the grace of someone who had once known freedom. The sight struck him in a way he hadn't expected. "Do you ever wish you could go home?" he asked, breaking the silence between them. She turned to face him, her eyes betraying a sadness that words couldn't capture. She nodded slowly. But then she stepped closer to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am here now. This is my home." Her words hung in the air. Eli wasn't sure what to make of them. For the first time, he realized that Naomi wasn't just some girl forced into a life she didn't want. She had been through things he couldn't imagine. She had survived. And perhaps he could learn to survive with her too. The next few weeks passed slowly, but they began to change. Eli, ever the solitary man, started to look at her differently, not with resentment, but with something akin to respect. They began to work together. Naomi helped with the chores. She learned to ride the horse Eli had once claimed as his own. Slowly, they started sharing moments that didn't feel forced. He would teach her how to read simple words, and she would show him Comanche customs, the songs her people once sang around the fire. Their marriage, once a forced arrangement, began to morph into something else. It was not a romance, but it was real. Eli's once cold heart warmed in her presence, and Naomi, despite her hardships, began to find strength in their shared silence. By the time the first frost of winter hit, they had come to depend on each other. Not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something that couldn't be explained in simple terms. In the end, the town never understood, but out in the wilds, Eli and Naomi have found something that neither had expected, a bond forged not by love, but by survival, and perhaps in time, something more.